hardship for the sake of the gospel. To bear hardship for the sake of the gospel. And it's this idea of bearing hardship for the gospel that I want to dive into today. And specifically the hardship that comes from being a disciple of Christ. From being a disciple of Christ. Christ called his followers disciples. And the disciple literally means student. So I'm talking to the right crowd, right? I'm talking to a bunch of students. But it's not, just coincidence that disciple and discipline come from the same word. Discipline is this spirit of self-control that St. Paul is also talking about in this reading. And for most of us, for me I know, self-control comes with great difficulty. It's hard. It's very hard. We have to endure suffering in order to obtain that kind of self-control. And that's why St. Paul says that we shouldn't be afraid to endure our share of hardship for the gospel. Discipline or discipleship, right, involves suffering. When you guys were younger, I'm sure you probably remember your parents disciplining you. Did your parents discipline you? Yes. If anyone's saying no, you're spoiled. Right? Your parents disciplined you. And when you were young and you were being disciplined, that was suffering, right? Like you didn't like it. It was hardship. But your parents weren't disciplining you for the sake of discipline. They weren't intending on causing you suffering. That's not why they did it. They were doing it because they loved you. They were doing it for your own good, because they wanted to impart into you that spirit of self-control. When you're a little kid and you're acting up, it's because you've lost control. Right? You're letting your little emotions and your little, my youngest is 4 years old and he was having a pity party when I arrived at my parents' house for lunch today. We always have lunch at Grandma's house on Sunday. And my family always gets there before I do because I'm busy with church things at St. Mary's. And so I arrive and he's sitting there at the table and he's got this delicious plate of food in front of him. And he's just got this grumpy look on his face. And I said, what's he upset about? And my wife said, he told me that he only wants me to put food on his plate that he likes, but not food that he doesn't like. But he won't tell me what food he likes. That's how we are when we're little kids, right? We got no sense of self-control, and we just let our desires run away with us. And our parents discipline us to teach us, how to do that, to give us that sense of self-control. But at the time, we receive it as suffering. We receive it as hardship. And this discipline then, when we get older, as you guys are older, as we become adults, we learn to apply that discipline to ourselves. You're here to pursue a course of study. You're here because you want to earn a degree. And as I'm sure you can tell me, you don't need me to tell you, that takes discipline to do that. Anytime you want to learn something new, learn a new language maybe, acquire a new skill, it takes discipline. If you start an exercise regimen, or a weight loss program or something like that, that takes discipline. We inflict that pain on ourselves for the sake of this good that we're trying to achieve. And if we're willing to do that for a college degree or for a better body or whatever it is that we're trying to do, how much more should we be willing to patiently suffer the hardships that come from being a disciple of Christ? If we examine the life of any saint, we'll see someone who did just that. Someone who was willing to suffer for the sake of Christ, to bear hardship for the sake of the gospel. And as an example, I want to focus this afternoon on just one saint who should be important to all of you sitting here. And that is the patron saint of campus ministry, who will be canonized as a saint 1 week from today by Pope Francis. I'm talking about John Henry Newman. How many of you have heard of John Henry Newman? A little bit more than half of you. That's good. That's good. Well, now you'll all hear about John Henry Newman. He was born in the year 1801 in England. And he wasn't born a Catholic. He wasn't born into a Catholic family. But he had a religious experience when he was about 15 years old that converted him, that converted his heart. And he became a very zealous evangelical Protestant. But as a 15-year-old, as you can probably guess, his heart was like 3 steps ahead of his brain. And so he had this desire, he had this love, this zeal for Christ, but he didn't quite know what to do with it. But he followed it. And by the time he got to college, to the age that you guys are now, he had matured a little bit in his faith, and he had come to appreciate the richness and the depth of Christian theology and tradition. And being English, and in England, he became an Anglican and practiced the Anglican faith. And he actually was ordained an Anglican priest when he was 24 years old. They did him young back then. He was ordained an Anglican priest at 24. He was also devoted to education. And I think for Newman, his devotion to Christ and his devotion to education were not 2 different passions, but just 2 aspects of the same passion, because Christ is truth. And he was devoted to learning the truth and to teaching that truth to others. And so in that sense, he was a true disciple. He was a student of all things. And so he was, decided that this was going to be who he was. He devoted his career to teaching other people and to studying. So he became a teaching fellow at Oriel College at Oxford. And that was his identity. He was a priest and a professor. This is who he was. This was his career. This is how he built his reputation. But the more that he studied the Christian faith, the more he became convinced that Protestant Christianity was intellectually indefensible. And I don't mean that as an offense to any Protestants that are here today. I'm glad that you're here with us. But Newman's perspective, as a Protestant Christian himself, as a priest in the Anglican Communion, he started to have problems with this. He belonged to a group called the Oxford Movement. And this was a reform movement within the Anglican Church at the time. And they were seeking to reform and restore Anglicanism to its true Christian roots. And more Newman was learning that its roots looked an awful lot like the Catholic Church. And that scared him a little bit, because anti-Catholicism in England at the time was very, very high. To be a Catholic was to be associated with the worst of the worst, the poorest of the poor. I mean, the Irish, they were the Catholics, right? Nobody wanted to be associated with them. So this scared him a little bit. And he sought out to defend Anglicanism as what he called the media via, the middle way, the middle road between Protestantism on one side and Catholicism on the other. It's like you don't have to choose, you can follow the middle road, the media via. And so he studied the history of the Anglican Church, looking to defend this, and he found that he couldn't. Because Christ didn't establish a middle road. Christ established a church, and it was the Catholic Church. And as he studied the writings of the Church Fathers, as he researched the history of the development of Christian doctrine, he realized, as he famously wrote later on, that to be steeped in history is to cease to be a Protestant. He realized that he was no longer a Protestant. And so in the year 1845, at the age of 44, after having been an Anglican priest for nearly 20 years, he was received into communion with the Roman Catholic Church. And you want to talk about bearing hardship for the sake of the gospel. For John Henry Newman, this did not just mean changing what building he went to worship in on Sunday morning. This meant abandoning nearly everything about his former identity. It meant abandoning his ministry as an Anglican priest. It meant abandoning his career as a teaching fellow at Oxford. You were not allowed to teach at Oxford if you were a Catholic. So goodbye career, goodbye classroom, goodbye students. It meant giving up his friends who would no longer follow him as a Catholic, no longer be associated with him. It meant giving up his credibility, giving up his good name, losing all respect. Anti-Catholicism was open and widespread in England at the time. He was ostracized. He was ridiculed. Why would he endure such a thing? I mean, he was doing very good work where he was. He was bringing souls to Christ. He was a very good Anglican priest. He was a very good professor. He's one of these professors that was tough, but everybody wants to take his class. You know, he was doing very good things, and it would have been so easy for him just to stay there and convince himself that, I'm doing good work. Why would he endure that loss of everything really that defined him to become a Catholic? It's because John Henry Newman did not have a spirit of cowardice. He had that spirit of strength and love and self-control that St. Paul is talking about in this second reading. Newman was not ashamed of his testimony for the Lord, and so he was willing to bear his share of hardship for the gospel, regardless of the personal cost to him. That's what fidelity looks like. That's what faith looks like. That's what conversion looks like. And that's why I'm so grateful that Cardinal Newman, soon to be St. John Henry Newman, is held up as an example to all of you as college students. The reason why he's considered the patron saint of campus ministry is because he would go on to advocate for the importance of faithful Catholic universities and for the establishment of Catholic ministry centers on the campuses of non-Catholic universities. Because he believed that for an education to be truly universal, and that's what you're supposed to be receiving here at a university, is a universal education. That's why they're called universities, right? A universal education. Newman believed for an education to truly be universal, it had to be Catholic. Because the Catholic Church is the custodian of that universal truth. That's what the word Catholic means. It means universal. Therefore, the Church has a responsibility to establish universities, which we've done for the past 800 years. The first universities in Europe were established by the Catholic Church. But the Church also has a responsibility to go out onto these Protestant universities and these secular universities, all of these non-Catholic universities, and to maintain a presence there, to help the Catholic students kind of remain firm in their identity as Catholics, but to bring this truth to the non-Catholic students as well. The truth of the Catholic faith is not something that we kind of hold to ourselves and guard like some little secret that we're not going to let anybody else in on. We want to go up on the rooftops and proclaim it. So Cardinal Newman wrote about the need for this. He says we can't exist just in our own little Catholic enclaves, but on every secular university out there needs to be a center for Catholic formation. And so the first Newman Center, as they would be called, if you go up north, typically they're called Newman Centers. We don't call ourselves a Newman Center because nobody around here would know what that was. They think it was another campus building or something. But same thing. The first Newman Center for campus ministry was established in the year 1893 on the campus of the University of Philadelphia, only 3 years after Newman's death. This campus ministry at Western was established in 1950. That was the year that Western Carolina College, as it was called at the time, it wasn't a university yet, Western Carolina College hired its first Catholic faculty member, Dr. Maurice Morrill. And he and his wife decided to open up their home to the 11 Catholic students that were enrolled at Western at the time on Wednesday nights for dinner and fellowship. And we still do Wednesday night dinners, but we have a little bit more than 11 students now. Look at you guys. I was bragging on you this morning at St. Mary's. I was telling all the parishioners there about how we fill up the chapel. And I said, I'm tempted to invite you to come and see for yourselves, but don't, because there's no more seats. We need every seat for the students that are coming. This is a beautiful ministry that we have here. I wish I could spend time getting to know each and every one of you personally. I would like to do that. As it is, we have about a dozen peer ministers, student leaders that help me to evangelize and to catechize on this campus. And I spend a lot of time working with them so they can go out and do these great things like lead the Bible studies, right? Help plan the retreats, to be that outreach on campus. We've got 8 people in RCIA right now who are working on becoming Catholic. And that's wonderful. And I spend a lot of time with you guys, and I see a lot of you guys here, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's a joy with me to spend that time working with all of you and seeing you deepen your relationship with Christ. I'm not just talking about the converts coming in through RCIA, but even those of you who have been Catholic your entire life. I see you deepening your relationship with Christ during your time here on campus. Because all of a sudden, your faith has got to be an adult faith. None of you are here right now because your mom and dad said, go to Mass on Sunday, right? Because mom and dad aren't here to grab you by the collar and pull you where you need to go. You're here because you want to be here. You're here because this is where you have decided to be. You have decided to worship God, and you have decided to grow in your faith. And that means that maybe for the first time for some of you, you're encountering the faith as an adult, as someone who is responsible for his or her own actions, and saying, I believe this. Now what do I do with it? What does this mean? How does this impact my life? And there's not a single person that I have talked with about this who hasn't confronted that with some sort of struggle. Being a true Christian disciple always involves some kind of struggle, because at the end of the day, being a disciple of Christ means conforming yourself to something that is beyond your own wants and your own desires. Conforming yourself to something bigger than yourself. And that is always hard. It is always hard to do. It takes humility, and it takes that spirit of self-control that St. Paul talks about. For any of us who has struggled in that, and struggled with what it means to be a Christian disciple, John Henry Newman can be that saint that you pray to for intercession, and that saint that you look to for inspiration. Because like him, God has not given us a spirit of cowardice. He has given us a spirit of power and love and self-control. You might wonder, what's love doing on that list? Power I get, self-control I get. Why is love listed right there in between power and self-control? It is because love is the key. Love is the one thing that's absolutely necessary, because love bears all things. Love is how we endure that hardship for the sake of the gospel. Because to love, after all, means being willing to suffer for the beloved. If you're not willing to suffer for the one that you love, I'm sorry, that's not love. It's something else. Love means being willing to suffer for the beloved. And Christ shows us from the cross how he loves us through his suffering. And when he says, take up your cross and follow me, what he's doing is he's inviting us to love him in return. So if we grumble and complain about how hard it is to follow Jesus sometimes, and I get it, it is, then we're like those unprofitable servants in the gospel today that only do what they're commanded to do. But if we bear our share of Christ's hardship with love, with patience, maybe even with joy, then we're no longer his servants, but his friends. And that's the definition of a saint, is a friend of Christ. So may we bear with joy whatever hardship comes our way for the sake of that enduring friendship that we hope for in Christ in the life to come.